muchas gracias por estar aquí. A quienes estuvieron el jueves pasado, gusto verlos aquí de nuevo. Y bueno, tenemos esta sesión del Seminario Diversidad Cognitiva, que es nuestra primera sesión presencial en casi 4 años de vernos en YouTube. Entonces también me da mucho gusto que podamos vernos. ¿Conocerlos? No, pues ya nos conocemos, pero nos reunimos en Zoom. Y bueno, pues aquí está el profesor José Luis Bermúdez con nosotros. Él es profesor de filosofía y profesor de Samuel B. Gammon de Humanidades de la Universidad Texas A&M. Y pues tenemos el gusto de tenerlo con nosotros. Lo hacemos igual que el jueves, preguntas durante la sesión. Okay, bueno.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. I was just saying that I've only 20 minutes early because I was half an hour late on Thursday thanks to the traffic. So today I decided to come by bicycle, and I've never been in a city where it takes an hour to travel 8.5 kilometers. But I got here.
Welcome to Mexico City.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here if I can make this work. I want to talk about something very dear to my heart that I've been working on and off for really quite a long time, probably nearly 30 years actually. And it's about basically ownership. And I want to talk about bodily ownership and psychological ownership. And I used to use the abbreviations. I've actually been studying, my Greek is pretty good, but I always get my phi and my psi mixed up. So I've stopped with that. And it's just bodily ownership and psychological ownership. And I want to talk to, well, Alejandro invited me. He said he wanted to do something on cognitive diversity, and I wasn't really sure quite what cognitive diversity was, but we talked a little bit, and the psychopathology seemed to be in the general ballpark. So I want to talk about how these different types of ownership are illuminated by psychopathology. I want to explain why I think they're interdependent and identify a sort of common thread that runs through both. So all my talks are the same. They're broken down into pieces. We're going to go through them. You'll see this slide 7 times, and hopefully we'll get some structure. So I want to review the basic phenomena of ownership and give you some experimental background. I want to very briefly, it's a sort of condensation of lots of things I've done in different places at different times. So I want to present a framework for thinking about ownership questions in general. I want to explore the Campbell-Frick model of psychological ownership, which you may be familiar with, but I'll review it. I want to present my own model of bodily ownership that I first presented, I think, in 19 well, many years ago. And I was just reminded earlier that how old I've got. And then I want to talk about the connections between ownership and psychological ownership and bodily ownership, and then present a sort of unified account. So those are going to be the stages. You'll know exactly where we are because you've seen it as recently. Okay, so here's the basic phenomena that we're talking about. So we started at 10 minutes after. Psychological, do you see? I make it a mistake. Bodily ownership is the phenomenon of taking one's body parts to be parts of oneself, and correlatively, taking one's body to be one's own. And this is something that's been discussed, quite a lot in analytic philosophy and in experimental psychology. It was actually one of the first areas where there was really some productive interaction between those two disciplines. And psychological ownership is the phenomenon of taking one's conscious thoughts, feelings, emotions, and other mental states to be one's own. So both of these are an important aspect of what it is to be self-conscious, to be aware of oneself as a reflective agent. And this is really the reason that I've been interested in them for so long. So starting off with bodily ownership. This has been studied in a number of different ways. The most recent discussions have been driven by experimental illusions. And those experiments manipulate where subjects feel sensations and consequently manipulate the judgments about their extent of their body and what is or is not a part of it. So one famous example is the rubber hand illusion. So subjects are shown a prosthetic hand, and it's stroked at the same time as they're being stroked, and they feel themselves, they feel that that hand is their own. And the body swap illusion is a very similar phenomenon, but it's a whole body thing because what's manipulated is a mannequin, and people have this kind of bizarre feeling of almost an extra corporal experience. But earlier discussions, and this is really, I've had a little bit of a role to play in generating this discussion, a book I edited in 1995 called The Body and the Self. And discussions about ownership and selfhood in that volume really focused much more on psychopathology than on illusions. No one had invented the rubber hand illusion then, but almost before the internet. And so what we looked at was sort of things like unilateral spatial neglect. So that's when patients feel only, they neglect one half of their body. So men with it will shave only one side of their face, or it's a very interesting phenomenon. Somatic paraphrenia, where people are alienated from parts of their body that deny they own. An alien hand, where people think that someone else is controlling their hand movements. So two strands really, sort of a psychopathological strand and an experimental strand. And the experimental background for psychological ownership, there aren't any illusions. I mean, maybe you could generate some with psychedelic drugs or whatever, but it's kind of hard to get that one through the IRB. So people who are interested in studying this from an empirically informed perspective have typically focused on psychopathology. And something that's been much studied is delusions of thought insertion in schizophrenia. I should say that, my view is that these are all really nice phenomena, but they're all much more complicated than they're typically presented as being. So just bear that in mind. Cotard syndrome is kind of an interesting one where people say that they think that they're dead. And depersonalization, where people are alienated psychologically from themselves. These are all really complicated multifactorial things, and often when people have got one of these, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So it's rarely clear cut. So people have talked a lot about ownership, and I think the debate has often been, to my mind, somewhat confused. So one of the things that I've tried to do is trying to impose a little discipline on the discussion, because sometimes, and we'll see an example of this shortly, but sometimes it's very unclear what the explanandum is and what the explanans is, what are the theoretical assumptions, what's the basic phenomena. So I think that here's something we need to avoid. My very good friend Frédéric de Vignemont has at times postulated the idea that there is a feeling of ownership. So she wrote in a paper in 2013, we experience our bodies as our own in virtue of a felt minus that goes over and above the mere experience of one's bodily properties. So her idea is that your experience of your body has kind of like a feeling of ownership, a quale of minus, some phenomenological thing that somehow tells you this is your own body. And I have a little bit of trouble with this idea, and I'll explain why in a minute. Certainly, the fact that you experience your bodies as your own doesn't entail that there's a feeling of ownness in your bodily experience. So I just want to reject this idea that there's a basic phenomenology of ownership or a basic feeling of minus in the bodily case and in the psychological case. And by the way, it's this idea it's quite a popular one with people coming out of a phenomenological tradition. Because you can find some ideas about pre-reflective consciousness in Husserl and stuff that resonates with this idea that there's a basic phenomenology of minus. But what I've tried to propose is that to try and get some clarity on this thing is that we need to start from explicit judgments of ownership. This is my hand. That's my hand in a rubber hand illusion, whatever. And working back from those, work out what they're based on. And my whole problem with this idea that there's a qualia or a feeling of mindness or whatever is that it seems impossible to characterize it in a way that provides independent support for the judgments to which it's supposed to provide independent support. Slide didn't work. So you just take a slight detour into some epistemology. So I think that there are two constraints upon epistemic grounding. I know, Santiago, you're an epistemologist now, so you can correct me if I'm going wrong. But I think that the way I think about it, if you're going to have if something's going to be a reason for something else, it's going to ground it, then these two things have to be true. There has to be focus and there has to be independence. The focus is that nothing can serve as a ground unless it's suitably aligned with what it's supposed to be grounded. So there's got to be some kind of relevant connection, some way in which something makes something more likely, more probable, more justified, whatever. But also there needs to be independence. So what I mean by that is that when you've got something justifying something else, they've got to be separate, right? They've got to be separately described. You can't have the justification it being impossible to describe the explanans, the thing that's doing the explaining, from the explanand of the thing that's being explained. And I think this is true, and it's also been interestingly developed by Elizabeth Anscombe in a series of papers on bodily awareness, but also in her book on intention. So I pinched and adapted an argument of Anscombe's against this whole idea that there's a feeling of ownership. So my argument is this. So you've got a choice when you're thinking about the qualia of mindness. You can either describe it internally, so in terms of what it feels like, that it's a tickle, or like a tickle or something, or you characterize it externally. And by externally, I mean in terms of its content. If you characterize it internally, then it fails the focus constraint, because you've just got a feeling, and a feeling is not going to stand in any kind of epistemic relationship to anything else. So if you look back at what Frederique said, her idea there's a felt minus. So somehow the content, what's doing the justification is the content of the content of the feeling. But the content of the feeling just is, this is mine, right? And that's the judgment that it's supposed to be justifying. So if you describe it externally, it fails the independence constraint. So to my mind, a compelling argument against any ideas about the feeling of mindness. And it's a useful argument. You can adapt this for all sorts of things. So it's the one-stop epistemology shop. All right. So what I propose to do instead is to start with judgments of ownership and then ask what those judgments are based on. So you can ask that question in two ways. You can ask it either causally descriptively. So you can talk about what's the mechanism, what's the origin, what's the machinery that makes it the case that we make judgments of ownership about our thoughts or about our bodies. And then we can ask it from a normative perspective. So what justifies, what graphs, what makes it rational, what makes it reasonable to make judgments of ownership. Okay, let me stop and ask if anyone's got any questions so far. Nope. Santiago.
Are these constraints only about reasons, or are they constraints about any kind of justification relation? Because you could have views according to which what justifies is not properly a reason, but something different.
Yeah. So that's good. So if you think about debates about justification warrant broadly, internally or externally, This is really on the internal side.
Nice.
So and where this gets kind of interesting is, so how do you need to think about the content of, well, one of the places where it gets interesting, how do you need to think about the content of perception so that it can satisfy simultaneously independence and focus?
Yeah.
But you can see there's a problem, right? If you go full McDowell and you think, well, the content of perception, I just perceive the room, and how can that justify the belief? Because the belief and then the perception come out the same. That's one end, and then you've got some kind of sense dating theory where you've got independence, but you fail focus.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got a theory, but it's different, but for a different topic, we'll have to invite you back.
Okay, good.
Any other questions? All right, good. Okay, so briefly on Campbell-Fritz's model of psychological ownership. So this was inspired by reflection on delusions of thought insertion. And thought insertion is when schizophrenic patients report that someone else is thinking in their head. If they've got thoughts, but they're not my thoughts. Thoughts, but they're not my thoughts. Someone else is thinking through me. And typically, this is famous people. It's kind of like reincarnation. No one's ever reincarnated as someone who built the pyramids. They're always reincarnations of Cleopatra. And it's the same with thought insertions. Typically famous people that are thinking in their head. So Campbell distinguished two aspects of psychological ownership. So there's self-description, which is ascribing a thought to oneself, very, very familiar to all of us, unity of apperception and various versions of it in Descartes. This is what people have typically studied for centuries, and not under the label of ownership, but as that phenomenon. And that's one part of it. But what thought insertion episodes seem to show is that there's another aspect, which is taking oneself to be the author or the producer, causally responsible for the thought. And thought insertion is where these things come apart, because you've got someone who self-ascribes the thought, right? It's my thought, it's just someone else's thinking. So a nice passage from a paper by John Campbell. At the very least, these reports by patients show that there is some structure in our ordinary notion of the ownership of a thought, which we might not otherwise have suspected. The thought inserted into the subject's mind is indeed in some sense his, just because it has been successfully inserted into his mind. It has some special relation to him. He has, for example, some especially direct knowledge of it. But on the other hand, there is, the patient insists, a sense in which the thought is not his, a sense in which the thought is someone else's. And not just in the sense that someone communicated the thought, originated the thought and communicated it to him. There's a sense in which the thought that the patient is thinking nonetheless remains the property of someone else. So what was interesting about the work that Campbell was doing, and why it was picked up from a sort of a interdisciplinary perspective, is that he dovetailed it with Christopher Fritz's model of schizophrenia. So he's got an interesting and influential theory of schizophrenia, in which it results from a breakdown of normal mechanisms of action monitoring. So in the background is a particular theory about how action works, the efference copy theory, which is popular in motor control circles, but goes back a long way into the 19th century German psychology. And the idea of efference copy is it's a theory about subpersonal mechanisms of action generation. Not all psychologists see clearly the distinction between different levels of explanation, but we need to keep it in mind. So there are ideas, you make an intention to act, and somehow that through a process as yet not very well understood, that generates motor instructions. And you're typically not going to be conscious of those. Conscious the intention, but not of the motor instructions. And then that goes to a comparator mechanism. And that mechanism then identifies from the changes that happen in the body, the movements, changes in perspective and orientation, it identifies which ones are the ones you're responsible for and which are the ones the environment is responsible for, and then adjusts so that you remain in equilibrium, and your feedback is, we understand which parts of the feedback that you're getting are correctly attributed to you and which parts are correctly attributed to to external factors. So that bit of the theory is pretty well understood, I think. And then Frick proposes that there's an analog at the level of authorship for thoughts, and then what happens is that the comparator mechanism breaks down and the disambiguation doesn't work. So normally you hear someone talking to you and you know that's thought, that came from outside, then you think to yourself, that came from me, and then when the thing breaks down, you think your own thought and you misattribute the ownership, and then you confabulate and you attribute it to someone else. Clear path or whatever. Yeah, Lorraine.
The disambiguation. Could you say a little bit more about it? About what kind of a mechanism that would be?
Yeah. So I mean, here's a very simple example that will illustrate. You must have had the experience. But this doesn't work for an American audience. This doesn't work for an American audience, but you might have had the experience of sitting in a train, and then the train the next door train starts to move. And you don't know, so you have perceptual input that there's movement, and you don't know whether it's you moving or the other train moving. That's the basic phenomenon that this trying to explain. Obviously, everything that you do generates changes in your perceptual field, and then you've got to disambiguate which are the changes that you caused and which are the changes that the world caused.
Right, but in the case of proprioception, what does that amount to?
Well, and you can see it even in the train case, because
okay.
When you at least this is my experience, when you think that it's you that's moving, that creates changes in your sense of balance, and so there's a kinesthetic awareness, right? An awareness of movement, and I start off, and sometimes in the past I have started off by thinking it's my movement, so I feel a sort of queasiness in my stomach. I'm very motion sensitive, and then I disambiguate, and then you realise that it's the other train, and then it goes well. So
does that have to do with sensory motor expectations? Okay.
Yeah. So this is like catnip for predictive processing. Okay, so just a quick comment on this. The Campbell-Frick account, I guess that's what you should call it. This is only talking about the causal descriptive machinery. This is not talking about what reasons you might have for authorship or for ownership. It's just telling you about the subpersonal mechanism, such that when it functions normally, you don't notice it, but when it goes wrong, then you have some kind of you have cognitive diversity and so on. All right. So I'll come back to this later, because one of the things that I'd like to talk about, hopefully we'll have time, is what might give you a non-causal descriptive sense of psychological ownership. All right, so we're making pretty decent time. All right, this one's going to be a bit longer. So, bodily ownership. Going back to what's the alternative account that we're going to offer instead of the quality of mindness, the pre-reflective sense of self, the stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in my view. So I want to start off with a few working hypotheses. So we can explain bodily ownership this is the first hypothesis. We can explain bodily ownership through explaining why we take events in our bodies to be our own. And I've taken that pretty broadly, so bodily movements, bodily sensations. So we need to think about, why do we take events in our bodies to be our own? And one reason for that is that we take them, we experience them as in our own bodies. This is pretty basic stuff. But there is a distinctive type of experience that's not a type of self-experience. It's not a qualia or minus or anything like that, but there is a distinctive type of experience that captures the way in which we experience things in our own bodies. And then the gloss that I want to put on that is that the space of the body is experienced very differently from how extra-bodily space is experienced. Okay, so if you think about the visual field, so you look at the world from a particular geometrical point of view, the famous picture of Ernest Mach looking at the world, framed by his glasses. And it's kind of Cartesian. You've got an origin, you've got planes, you can plot locations on that, and that's how we interact with the world. Essentially, whatever those motor instructions are that yield to action, it's a pretty safe bet that they're probably on body-centered Cartesian coordinates. So you reach to a particular place at a location on a coordinate system fixed by your eyes or where the origin of your hand and all that sort of stuff. So what I want to say is that's how we experience the external world, but it's not how we experience the bodily world. And that type of bodily space sometimes sounds as if I'm going full Merleau-Ponty, but anyway, it's a view, right? So the distinctive features of how the space of the body experienced are where the distinctive physical ownership, the origins of physical ownership and bodily ownership. All right. So there are two features, I think, of this kind of distinctiveness of how events are experienced in the body. And the first one I call boundaries. Bodily events are experienced within the experienced body. It's not quite a tautology because the experienced body and the real body don't always coincide. If you've got prosthetics like a blind person's stick, then it extends. If you've got unilateral spatial neglect, then it shrinks, and then you can distort it in all sorts of ways. All right, so boundaries. And then the second one is connectedness. So what I want to say is that the spatial location of a bodily event is experienced relative to the disposition of the body as a whole. So I've just touched the palm of my hand. That is at a particular location in space, in some sort of objective space, but also in terms of a space, external space on a coordinate system centered on my eyes. But that actual sensation that I have when I do that is also experienced at a particular location in my hand, which is on top of my forearm, which is attached to my torso by my upper arm with an angle at the elbow. My elbow is touching the table. And that's all part of what it is to have that feeling in my hand. And that is nothing like that is involved in seeing the coffee cup, the verbal coffee cup. And in a sense, all of this stuff goes back really to the torso, and the torso itself is experienced as being disposed a certain way relative to gravity and relative to supporting surfaces.
So,
yeah,
are these features typical? Are you talking about these features are as typical or as something constitutive of bodily owners?
I would say typical.
Okay.
I'd say this is just the way in which it normally is, and it can go wrong, right? There are patients, I can't remember the condition, but they report having disembodied sensations.
Okay.
You know, out there. I mean, weird stuff happens. But in the normal case, this is how I think things go. I'm not sure if you're allowed to say normal anymore. Yeah.
Just yeah, you mentioned that this representation would be not in a Cartesian plane as that of the beyond the bounds of the body, right? But wouldn't the idea is not that this whole thing is located in a kind of objective framework within which your body is and it has certain limits, but that the external world would be represented using different principles, right?
Sure.
So that these principles of connectedness and boundedness would govern how we experience or represent our own bodily ownership.
Our own bodies, yeah. And then, but you can experience your own bodies in multiple ways, right? And you can see how your hand is disposed. But that's not the same as how I can see myself clenching my fist and I can feel myself clenching my fist. And
Yes.
I think that there are two different spatial things going on there, according to the modalities.
But they still intermingle, right? We can still kind of systematically correlate our own bodily position in the Cartesian framework.
And that's the I guess a crude way of thinking about it would be that's the interface between proprioception, kinesthesia, touch, and vision. Right. So and this is not just about spatiality, because then there are interesting questions about the even about the content of the cross-modal content of perception. So most famously, Molyneux's problem type things is the touched shape, the haptically perceived shape. How does that relate to a visually perceived shape? Okay, so now we're back on proper presentation. So talk a little bit about boundedness. So the idea that everything is experienced within the experience body. So boundedness predicts that subjects are going to experience the rubber hand, and the rubber hand illusion was incorporated into their own bodies, as opposed to being just sort of another bit that's out there. And that's kind of what happens. And it's interesting also that the rubber hand illusion is constrained by anatomy. So the hand that is out there has got to be aligned more or less the right way for the rest of the body. It's got to fit your sense of how your body fits together. And if the hand's too large, then it's not going to work. And it can't be the wrong laterality, right? It can't be a left hand if the hand that's being stroked is a right hand. So there's kind of like a body image that drives without the right kind of large scale body image, the illusions don't work. And I think the connectedness is also borne out by the illusion. So you can get rid of it, and that's a better suggestion. I mentioned that before, I should mention it now. Postural mismatches will extinguish the illusion. So if your hand is if you know that your wrist and your arm are disposed a certain way, and that's physically impossible for that hand to do that, then you're not going to get an ownership illusion. So the idea is, what that seems to show is that you're experiencing the stuff in the hand and as a continuous part of the physical body. Yes, this is that.
Yes, I was remembering of we're calling this technique used by Ramachandran to relieve on phantom arms pain, that the muscles are all tense, using a simple mirror. But It's all about location. It's crucial that it's in the right place. So you have a phantom left arm. It's crucial that the mirrors correctly located so that your right arm looks like that. And
Yeah, I've forgotten that. That's a really good example.
yeah.
Good, thanks. Oops. All right. Now here's a challenge. How do you explain the experience space of the body in a way that explains bandedness and connectedness? So let me say a few words first about what I think, the way in which I think this is standard. I mean, the people don't think about this a whole lot, but when they do think about it, you know, it's like the guy in the Dos Equis sense. When they do think about it, they tend to come up with a broadly Cartesian model. So basically, you know, people think about the body, then there's peripersonal space, the bits around you that are kind of within reaching distance and so on. And then the external space. So typically people will conceptualize the space of the body on a Cartesian frame relative to the sagittal, the frontal, and the transverse plane. So I always get these wrong, but start with the front. That's the front from the back. The transverse is the top from the bottom, and then that by elimination, sagittal must be the left from the right. And the origin is going to be the body's center of mass. And I think that's very plausible, but the rest of it not so much. So one advantage of that is that it allows a really easy mapping between bodily space and peripersonal space, because then you just simply, it's basically like a shifting from one coordinate system to another. You just change the origin, and you just then it's a simple function to move on the other. But what I find unsettling about it, or unsatisfactory about it, is that it makes the space of the body completely continuous with extrapersonal space. So there's nothing intrinsically about this location here that brings out the fact that it's connected to me via all this stuff, and it's not, you know, then the origin's there. It's not a straight line. Like it's not. You might think about this as polar coordinates. So you start with the origin, you specify an angle, and then it goes to there, which is fine. But that doesn't distinguish between the it doesn't identify the whole connectedness piece. It gives you a good way of getting there. Sorry, Alejandro.
Another problem I'm thinking about is when you divide the body like that, it's in an anatomical position. But then, for instance, I can put my right arm on the left, and that is hard to model.
Well, you could do it, because if it starts being here, and that's a certain set of polar coordinates from here, then you move it to there, and you just change the angle and the distance on the polar coordinates.
So there's something tracking where
Sure. Yeah, all of this stuff. So you're constantly updating the spatial location. The question is, what's the coordinate system that you're using?
Oh, okay. Because I was thinking perhaps thinking in topological terms would make more sense. Let me think more about that. But,
ask me a question at the end, because I've got four slides that I held in reserve.
Okay.
If someone asks about it, Lorraine.
Just very personal space. What is that?
Peripersonal space is the space immediately around your body. So again, think about this intuitively. It's the space such that you don't like people coming into it unless you invite them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's defined by, you know, you can think about it also in terms of motor control.
Okay.
What's going on there? Okay. Yeah.
I'm having trouble thinking about the boundaries, because every sensorial modality takes you beyond your bodily space, I think. But intuitively, that seems to me to be bodily space still. So the boundary between bodily space and non-bodily space seems to me to be really possible. Because when you see something, it's in part But
Well, none of this applies to vision.
none of this implies what?
None of this applies to vision.
Okay. But you're talking of,
Think about proprioception. So you have receptors in your joints and skin and stuff, and it'll tell you about the orientation of your limbs. You've got homeostatic feelings like hunger and pain and things like that.
yes.
And then you've got touch. And touch is interesting because it tells you about your body and it tells you about the outside world
Yes.
at the same time. And what I'm talking about is all the bodily related stuff.
Okay.
So what you have with touch is
Okay.
all right,
I think.
good questions. But don't forget to ask me at the end, so I can show you. Then I can show you the pictures. All right, so I propose two ways of thinking about bodily location. So moving away from this idea that there's a single coordinate system that plots events in the body, I think we need to think about a particular bodily event. Let's say a pain, everyone's favorite example. So you experience a pain in a particular body part relative to a sort of abstract map of the body, a body image. So you've got a pain in your foot, and you experience that as being in your foot, which is at the end of your leg and so on. So everything that you experience in your body has an A location, and I think it also has a B location. And the A location corresponds to the boundedness constraint, and the B location corresponds to the connectedness constraint. And it's not just that you experience pain in your foot. Simplicity, you experience it in your foot, which is currently disposed in a certain way relative to the rest of your body. So, in a sense, you've got an A location, and then the B location fixes that relative to where your body's disposed. So, kind of says again what I said before, but you touch the palm of your hand like that, the A location, it's your hand, you know that your hand is at the end of whatever, however your body's disposed, you know that something hasn't gone badly wrong, it's still at the end of your arm. But the specific spatial content is that it is disposed a certain way. It's in your hand, which is currently disposed a certain way, not just at this point in space, objective space, but at this point, at the end of a succession of body parts. So what I've tried to do is to work out this kind of abstract idea of A location, B location in a more concrete way. Model might be a fancy word, but let's think about it as, let's think about the body as a relatively immovable torso. I'm actually, if you do a lot of yoga, then you probably, your torso is more movable than your upper arm, for example. So maybe relatively movable is not a good word. But think about it as a torso that's connected by joints to movable body parts. So you've got a joint here, super joint, the shoulder, which connects to your upper arm, and then you've got the elbow. The shoulder's got many more dimensions, variation than the elbow. That's one of the great things. And what the whole point of a joint is that it affords the possibility of moving the body parts that are attached to them. So the idea that I've been pressing is that you need to think about the body in terms of joints and body parts, and joints provide fixed points relative to which you can plot particular A locations and particular B locations. I shouldn't have taken the pictures out. Pictures tell 1,000 words, but anyway, we'll get to them. So my thought is that if you have the pain in your hand, for example, then its A location is experienced in a body part, and that's specified relative to the joint. So the A location of the pain in my hand is specified relative to my wrist. The B location is specified recursively in terms of all the joints that lie between the wrist and the torso. So the B location is, you've got an A location somewhere in my hand, fixed on a coordinate system relative to my wrist, but then the position of my wrist is fixed by the angle of the next joint along, which is the elbow, which is then fixed by the angle of the next joint along, which is my shoulder, and then my body is going to be fixed relative to gravity. You know, I could be leaning forward, I could be leaning back, I could be upside down, I could be riding my bike, whatever. Okay, so that's the basic idea. But kind of sort of starting off really from boundedness and connectedness and trying to build an account of the way in which the space works inside the body that will do justice to both of those things. And there is some foundation in reality here. So, or not, well, maybe not in reality, but this is very continuous with some work in robotics of how robots are, how the movements of robots are planning.
Sorry, just one question. But in case of biological actual systems, would you say those two types of sorry, I'm not thinking into it. Okay, are these two systems evolutionarily independent, or do you?
No, I think so. See if I can think of a good illustration for this. So, by which two? When you say two, A and B, no. So the A location is. Think about it as one way of specifying a position, but that's got two dimensions. So that's the location, and you can think about it. So where do you feel the pain? In my hand. A location. Where do you feel the pain? In my hand at a certain point relative to the disposition of my whole body.
Oh, okay, but
B location.
You're not saying there are two systems responsible for. Okay.
No,
I was reading much into that.
David.
In the case of phantom pain and a phantom limb, is that experience, I mean, is obviously not the same. So how do you account for that?
When you say obviously not the same,
that you are not experiencing in that limb a pain.
but you are.
An A location or a B location.
But you are.
So explain how that works. Where is the pain?
The pain is in the experienced phantom. And the experienced phantom is part of the experienced body.
And so
And it has
boundary doesn't matter in that second case.
no, and that's what I emphasize in presenting the boundedness, because boundedness is it's experienced boundary, not real boundary.
But
So
you
that's
did
the
say
point
there
about
was
a
a
phantom
grounding
limb.
in reality.
Sorry?
But you did say there was a grounding in reality. So can you?
Oh yeah, sorry, I made a different grounding in a different reality.
Okay.
So what I mean for the yeah, that was an aside. So the theoretical point here is that what phantom limb shows is that the experienced body and the real body come apart. But it's part of the phenomenology of the phantom that you don't have a disembodied pain. You have an embodied pain in a phantom limb. That's why you have the phantom limb. And I think people with phantoms are protectable. You know, if you're going through a narrow gap and you've got a phantom limb, you're pretty careful that the phantom doesn't get caught in the thing. So it's really is part of the experienced body.
So the grounding in reality is not necessary.
The grounding reality, there has to be somebody there, right? There has to be some physical mechanism that creates the projection of the phantom limb. You can extinguish it, as Esteban pointed out, with mirrors. You can, by the way, you can also get rid of unilateral spatial neglect by pouring water into people's ears. So clearly, there's some vestibular thing going on there, but it doesn't map onto reality in a totally precise way.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And this proposal is only about external body parts, or what about the internal ones? How we experience a sense of ownership of my heart, for example, of my lungs, with these tools, with this proposal.
So the heart and the lungs. So you're thinking about a case like me. Yesterday I went and rode my bike to Ahushka. So I felt a lot of ownership of my lungs on the way up. The mountain, my heart is about 7,000 beats a minute. So there, the coordinate system is going to be inside the torso, and it's going to be relative to the center of mass of the torso. And then again, you know, it's going to be thinking it's going to be different if you're. Let's stay on my bicycle. So it's going to be different if you're up like this on the handlebars, or if you're crouched like that over the handlebars. And that's going to be fixed by the position of the torso relative to gravity.
Okay. Thank you.
It seems to me that action has, like the possibility of movement, has an important role here.
Yeah, you spotted it. That's where we're going.
Okay. Okay, so hold
on, because that's going to be the way in which the psychological ownership and the bodily ownership come together.
Nice. Okay.
All right. So my idea is that the basis for bodily ownership is the distinctive experience of the body, and it's not a quality of ownership. It's not a feeling of mindness, but it's a distinctive form of experience. And I think going Merleau-Ponty again, it provides a kind of clear demarcation between the space of the self and the space of the non-self. All right. So how are we doing for time? I'm doing all right. Yeah, I'll just stipulate that. Okay, so explore the connections between psychological ownership. But we're taking the questions as they go along, which I think may work better, and so we can take a little bit more time. So let's explore the connections a bit between psychological ownership and bodily ownership, and this is going to take us to the agency piece. So first interdependence is that probably the most important source for taking our bodies and body parts as our own is the conscious bodily experience. It's our conscious bodily experience through bodily sensations, proprioception, kinesthesia, sensations of movement, and the sense of touch. So that's telling us about our body. But of course, all of these things are also occurrent mental events, such that the question of psychological ownership arises from them. And sort of interesting historical aside here, people have taken, over the centuries, people have taken different things to be paradigmatically mental events. If you read 20th century analytic philosophy, the paradigmatic mental event is the pain. And that's really not, if you look at Descartes, when you look at the ancient Greeks, that's really not what they took as a paradigmatic mental event in the slightest. But I think they're all mental events. So pain's bodily events, when we make judgments about them, we attribute them to ourselves. So they have, in a sense, they're both tools for telling us about, from the ownership perspective, they're both tools for telling us about bodily ownership, but they also raise the question of psychological ownership. So in a sense, our sense of bodily ownership presupposes psychological ownership. But there's also interesting interdependences, and interesting interdependence is the other direction. So if you say, this is my thought, or this is my belief, or even this is my pain, that's the basic form of a judgment of psychological ownership. But at the same time, you're attributing this, the referent of the I is the embodied subject of those states that are taken to be the subjects. And I think there's more going on here. I mean, But this is usually the point at which someone raises their hands and says, well, but what about a disembodied Cartesian ego? Say, well, fine. Things might be different for a disembodied Cartesian ego, but I'm talking about normal human beings. So, in a sense, psychological ownership presupposes physical ownership. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this, because I think there's some really important points about the phenomenology of experience that haven't been as well understood and as well disseminated as they should be. And I'm not claiming any originality here. Michael Ayers wrote a very long book on Locke, on John Locke, that also has a lot of really interesting general stuff in it. And one of the things that he talks about in the context of Locke's theory of sensitive knowledge is what he calls the integrated sensory field. So I'm writing a book on Aristotle's De Anima. Aristotle treats every sense separately. Every sense has its special object. So the special sense of the objects of sight are colors, the object of sense, smells and so on and so forth. And it's almost like you have split personality, different, each sense does a separate job. And one of the things that Michael Ayers points out and actually finds in Locke is that this is clearly not a good description of how we find our way around the world. So he writes, there are not therefore several sets of apparent directions, auditory, tactual, visual, proprioceptive, vestibular, and perhaps olfactory, which we learn or are innately inspired to associate or identify with one another. Rather, there is one space which we can be aware in different but essentially integrated ways. The 5 or more senses are not distinct inlets for quite disparate, internally unconnected data. So he's not saying, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a binding problem in the subpersonal mechanisms of machinery. It's clear as anything is in sensory neuroscience, that visual stuff, different aspects of visual information get processed separately, visual information gets processed separately from auditory, all that's absolutely clear. But from the phenomenology of what it's like to experience the world, it ain't like that. It's much more like this integrated sensory field. And this idea has been extended, interestingly, by Michael Type. So at any given moment, he writes, there's just one experience here, described in 2 different ways. This experience represents the sounds, smells, taste, surfaces, and so on in the world in relation to my body, its parts, and their boundaries, together with various bodily disturbances. My current experience is closed under conjunction across the board. Like any good analytic philosopher, very sensible point followed by an unnecessary technicality. Right, so then he takes this idea of a single unified experience still further to include emotions, feelings, and current thoughts. So it's not just that there's an integrated sensory field, there's what I call an integrated somatosensory affective cognitive field, which is probably the ugliest thing that I've ever written, but it's not a bad description of what's actually going on when you engage with the world. It's all continuous. Your emotions color your perceptions, your bodily awareness orients your perceptual perspective on the world. So when you think about psychological ownership, you need to think about the self-attribution of thoughts and other mental states as part of this integrated let's just call it the mega field. So, all right. So now we can get to your point. Thank you for waiting patiently. So how are we going to connect these two things? I don't think there's any prospect of a single unified account of ownership. It's not going to happen. But there's something common running through these two things. And I think that what's important, as was pointed out, is that both accounts really foreground the notion of agency. And I think it was kind of a little more obvious in the bodily case, but it's also the case in the psychological case. So let's think about agency and bodily ownership. So boundedness. as it's reflected in a location. What is your sense of the limits of your body? Well, the sense of your limits of your body is the sense of what you can do, what you can move directly. I think, and what's interesting, again, to go back, Dave, to your phantom, is that people with phantom limb can move their phantoms. If they had an immobile phantom that was not responsive to your will, it would go away. I think then that's kind of important. By the way, I could be completely wrong about this, so feel free to check on it and get back to me if I am. But I think that your sense of your body limits is very, very closely tied to your sense of what is directly responsive to your will. And then this was what you pointed out, the basic idea of connectedness and bilocation builds your agential capacities directly into the content of bodily experience. Because what you experience is not just the pain in the hand there, but the pain but the hand that can move in certain ways that you can scratch and so forth. And the bodily location is specified in terms of variables that are directly under your control. It's up to you, right? What angle your upper arm is at relative to your shoulder, lower arm relative to generally, of course, you can be tied up to things. And those joint angles specify the position of effectors. So if you imagine, like you're designing a robot, or you're thinking about what the motor system looks like, and you think, well, how do I compute? What's the computation that takes my hand to my cut? How do you code the starting location of the hand? Well, if it's going to be in a way that's going to make it possible to move it, because your movement is going to be changing the angle, it's going to be changing all these angles. That's what a movement is. So my idea is that the best way to code the starting point of your hand is in a way that is going to be easy to translate into motor instructions. So changing those angles. But agency is also really important in psychological ownership. So part of what it is to take a thought of one's own is to take it to be something that you can deploy in conscious reason. So this is too obvious to point out if you're not suffering from a delusional thought insertion. But the interesting thing about the thought insertion case is that you can't reason from your alien thoughts. You're, in one sense, not in another. If somebody's putting thoughts in your head, they're your thoughts in the sense that they're in your head, but they're not your thoughts in the sense that you can start drawing conclusions from them and use them as part of your reflections about the world. So they're not available for cognitive agency. And I think that the fact that they're not available for cognitive agency is part of why ownership is denied. So it's partly where did they come from, but it's also what can you do with them? So, yeah, Lorraine.
Just like it occurred to me that, the sort of control that you have of your own body's movements, sort of control you have over your thoughts, there's a qualitative difference, isn't there, between those two sorts of controls?
Sure.
They fall under agency in a broad sense. Yeah. But yeah,
and that's why I'm saying, look, there's a common thread. You're not going to be able to say they can both be reduced to this.
Okay.
Thing, but I think that maybe what I want to say is that there are. Common thread is one way of putting it. Maybe a better way of putting it would be to say there are structural commonalities, right? No, not isomorphism. You can't map them onto each other, but there's a common structure and the role of agency. In both.
Very abstract, right? Abstract commonalities.
She saw it.
Sorry, what did you say?
No, it's not so abstract that it's not kind of apparent that you can see the connection.
Yeah, okay.
That's all.
Yeah, but not nothing in the implementation level. No similarities in the implementation.
No, I think it would be bizarre. I think it would be Yeah, no, I don't think that the mechanism that makes it that makes a thought available for conscious reasoning is going to be anything like the mechanism that plots actions.
Yeah.
But they might have similar features, right? They might both involve, for example, a comparison mechanism or some kind of feed-forward mechanism.
Yeah, because predictivists want to make everything similar in the mechanistic level.
You're right, and Lorena's right too. If you look far enough from enough of a distance, everything is similar.
Yes.
So you want to find out that sweet spot. All right, so ownership and practical reasoning. So our core cases of practical reasoning issue in bodily action. And so the bodily features in practical reasoning, because part of what it is to reason practically is what can you do with your body as it's currently configured, and that's going to be a function of the spatial content. So what we're capable of moving is circumscribed by the experienced body, not just because the A location gives you what's responsive to the will, but boundedness tells you what actions you can actually perform at a given moment. So as you implement, as you act, as you behave in the world, your success and continued movement depends upon constantly updating awareness of bodily position. So go back to the Cartesian. I actually really like Descartes, and it annoys me that the Cartesian is taken as the target here. It's unfair. But anyway, it's a Cartesian coordinates, great geometry. So if you think about it in terms of Cartesian coordinates, it's much more helpful if you're keeping track of the location of your hand in terms of this angle than in terms of its position in space relative to the coffee cup. What matters are the adjustments that you make down here for the movement to be successful. All right. So here are my conclusions. So agency is the common thread or a structural common structure linking body ownership and psychological ownership. Taking one's body as one's own is being aware of it as directly responsive to the will, both in an abstract sense, but also in the fact that we experience things in ways that are directly tied to our capacities, potentialities, to move them. And taking one's thoughts, emotions, and perceptions as one's own is to take them as potential premises in reasoning and deliberation. So there are such things as mental actions, and the mental states that you take as your own are potential objects for mental actions. And there are physical actions, obviously, and those mental states are also potential causes of physical actions. So that's a real. Thank you. When I see so many hands go up, I always think I must have said something very obviously false. On the right, go across. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, teacher. I have a question. It's inspired in a concept of Austin. He talks about excluded concepts.
Austin.
Yeah, Austin. So he said that some concepts don't describe a positive feature, but it's more the absence of some features.
Right.
Things about the certainty or the belief the external world exists. It's not have a trust that the external world exists or something like that. But it's more the absence of the doubt of the existence of the existence of the external world. No? So my question is, when you said that the ownership is not acquired, is not qualia, you are saying that the ownership is a excluded concept.
That's a really interesting question.
If you are not saying that, why thinking ownership, bodily ownership and psychological ownership, thinking that in terms of excluded concept is not correct or
right, but what do you? So I'm not a. Your knowledge of Austin is clearly better than mine. So you're going to have to explain to me: is it a good thing to be an excluded concept or not? Or does
I like that.
Right, but does it? What you said makes it sound as if what Austin was saying is if you've got an excluded concept, then you shouldn't worry about it so much.
I think I don't understand the question.
So, from what you said, I think that ownership is an excluded concept.
Yeah.
And because well, yes and no. It's an excluded concept in the sense that while it suggests that maybe that there's some sort of aspect of experience that corresponds to it, I don't think there is.
Yeah.
But it's not but there still is nonetheless a genuine feature of experience.
Okay.
But it's so let me put this in, there's a famous saying that of Dan Dennett's where he says the feeling of an absence is not the absence of a feeling.
Okay. Yeah.
And that I think that's exactly right with ownership. So when ownership goes wrong, there's an absence, but that doesn't mean that there's the absence of a feeling. There's the feeling of an absence, but there isn't the absence of a feeling. And what I think that's gone wrong with Vignemont and others is that they make that mistake. And I'm absolutely positive that Dennett was copying, well, not copying, but borrowing thoughts of Austin.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Santiago, you were next.
Thank you. I really like your account, but there is something I'm missing, which is it's a descriptive account in which you don't have, at least explicitly, room for an evaluative component. And I think that evaluations might play a key role in our experience of our own body. For instance, if I fall, I would use my hands to protect my head.
Right.
Which suggests that my head doesn't have the same degree of importance as my hands have. Or at least I'm evaluating, or there is something evaluating the relative importance of my head relative to my hands. One might also think, and then we put a little bit of pressure on you, that an account of peripersonal space should be evaluative. I mean, you are evaluating this space.
I did present it in an evaluative way. I mean, that's it.
Yeah. No, I'm just offering this alternative. So it's so important to my survival that some things are very far, or far enough so that I can maybe protect myself just in case something happens. So one might think that an account of the difference between peripersonal space, my own body, and the rest of the space might need to appeal to evaluation. So I'm evaluating the relative importance of some space around me. So I was missing this evaluative component. And I think it's important because in some of the cases you were describing but didn't explain, there are problems in emotions. So in depersonalization, people report flat emotional life.
Yeah.
So that might be related somehow because emotions evaluate. So that's one of the things they do for us. So I'm just curious to see whether you would be willing to integrate that, because I think that what's moving the qualia theories like Frederick, she's very impressed by emotions.
She is.
And that's why she says we have to think about the body as the hot map. It's hot. It has something. And it's not because she's thinking of the emotions as reasons for belief, but rather as coloring our bodily experience. And then, anyway, so that's a line of thought. What do you think about that?
Look, it's plainly true. The question is what explains what, and that line of thinking that Frederick pursues, and basically the idea is the body is that thing for which one has special concern. I mean, that's just a crude way of putting it, but I am interested in what happens here in a way that I don't about what happens there. And that line of thinking goes back to Locke. So I think that the question to my mind is, well, how do you pick out the bit over which you have special concern? If you have unilateral spatial neglect, you don't have special concern behalf of your body. So what do you have spatial concern? Well, you have spatial concern for the bits that fall in the boundaries in your experienced body, the bits that have allocations. So I think that the account I'm offering is not really a competitor to what she's proposing. She needs my account in order to give hers. And we will agree that the body is that thing for which you have special concern. And I'm just saying, well, how does space work? And part of what it is to be special concern for the body is that what that thing is for which you have special concern is that bit for whose space you experience in the way I'm describing.
I think you both need each other.
Absolutely. Well, I've always said Good. And then I forgot who was next. Yes, you.
Okay, so
I'm going this way. So if you think you're next in order, then start.
So thank you for this talk. I have 3 questions. I don't know, but the first one. So after the account you presented, I was thinking if maybe this map, this abstract map of the body that you talked about at the beginning, can be characterized as first relative to one perceived capacity to what you think you are able to do, and second as a historical thing that is maybe shaped and changed during life, especially during development, right? And then you can account of why quantum leaps are made.
Right.
The second question is whether the relationship between your personal space, your bodily space, and the very personal space, as Esteban was asking, can be rather than thinking of it as a one-to-one correspondence, or maybe trying to map what's happening. You can think of space like out there in terms of what you can do with that space, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's two questions.
Let me deal with the first one, then you can remind me because I've got the second one by then. So, look, I mean, there are lots of different forms of bodily awareness. So, people talk about the body image. There's dozens of different types of body image. So, Brian O'Shaughnessy wrote a book called The Will in the 1970s, maybe in 1980, which he distinguished the short-term body image from the long-term body image. And the long-term body image is kind of like your understanding of what your body is. But there's lots of long-term body images. You've got a body image that's formed by cultural factors. You know, you've got a semantic understanding of different body parts. You know, cultural norms about how you interact with people in a bodily way. I mean, there's lots of different dissociable components here, and I think it's really important to keep them separately. And all I want to talk about here is the as it were, the spatiality of bodily experience. That's not to say that these other things aren't important.
Right, but even if you talk about all the spatiality in terms of agency, maybe there is some minimal sense of history that you have to have there, like the updating that you were talking about.
Sure.
Right. Okay.
So you have to, at a minimum, you need to know certainly where you are and how you got there in the recent past.
Mm-hmm.
But the recent past, I mean like seconds, not days or months.
Okay. Okay. As for the second question, if you could say something more about the relationship between this body space that you accounted to explain, and how we relate them to the rest of the world, right? To the other space. Now that is running on agency, whether we'll think of it differently.
I mean, in a sense, that's a $64 million question. So you've got two completely different coordinates, more or less completely different, and action depends upon mapping them correctly. And I don't know how that works, but I take comfort in the fact that no one else does either. I mean, the benefits of the views that I was criticizing are that they make that problem a little bit a little bit easier.
Right. Yeah, this you give a hint, right? Okay, let's look at agency to try to understand this relationship. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I think in a sense that the entry point to that problem is going to be action coordination and mapping two different frames of reference on each other.
If I may say, ecological psychology is in the business of doing that.
I know, I'm a big fan of well, ecological psychology can go multiple different ways, but I'm a big fan of the specific tradition coming out of Gibson and the idea of affordances and optical flow, and I think those things are all really important. But Gibson made the mistake that everybody mistakes, is thinking that thinking that one part of the problem is all of it. And he is alien, he wouldn't accept the idea that there are coordinate systems and computations and mapping problems and all that sort of stuff. And that's why people don't take him as seriously as they should. I think they got confused by the rhetoric and didn't see the real insight behind it. That's my view on Gibson. I'm an enthusiast. Who's next? Right.
Just wondering whether you don't need also a location C. You have A and B, right?
Maybe.
But the torso has joints and it moves, right? And so
torso is a difficult one.
it is. Could you explain or expand a little bit?
I think you need to think about the position. You need the external effectors, as it were. You can think about them. You can go backwards from them to the torso. For the torso, the only thing you've got really is the center of gravity. So, but then how do you map different orientations? Exactly as you point out, you can do yoga. If you've got a yoga, you can do a heck of a lot more than this. And how do you map that out? And I think just off the top of my head, the way I would think about that would be, how are your shoulders? It's your shoulders that are moving. How are their position changing relative to the center of gravity in the torso at the same time as your hips remain constant?
Okay.
But that's clearly, I don't think you need it. I think you can do that within this framework, but I'm just not kind of sure how to do it.
Right. Just a little defense of Descartes. I think Descartes would say pain. I mean, the feeling of pain is a mental thing, right? And although there was no,
I'm not sure he would. So think about his views on lack of animal.
Yeah, but
cognition.
Well, I think there's the element of pain in Descartes, at least Descartes of imagination.
Right.
There is an element of pain that is mental, and there is an element of sensations that are mental. I don't think the thinking of proprioception and kinesthesis and so on, I don't think that's part of it, because there was no concept of those sorts of feelings or sensations. But yeah, there are some sensations are mental things. They are always represented as being in the body, right? They are being represented, are there ideas or representations as being in the body, even if there's no body, right? Of course. So yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting, and so I've done some work on Descartes over the years. You may know that John Cottingham's idea that Descartes is not a dualist, he's a trialist.
Sorry?
That Descartes is not a dualist, he's a trialist.
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
So I mean, and that's kind of an interesting tradition in.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there are. Descartes does think that there is a certain coordination between imagination which is a form of representation that is spatial and sensorial, right? And the body itself, right? There has to be some sort of a coordination between those two things, but definitely there's an aspect of pain that is part of that coordination, right? Body mind coordination. Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Going left, David, and then
Okay, I have one question made by Axel Barceló, and then one I want to make. So I'm gonna read.
I keep forgetting there are other people involved in this whole thing.
So Axel said, "We constantly take other people's thoughts as premises in reasoning and deliberation. We take other people's feelings in consideration. We ponder what other people think about things, etc. So it seems that to take one's thoughts as one own is not the same as to take them as potential premises in reasoning and deliberation." That's a comment.
Well, and I think that's a great point. And it's true that you can take other people's thoughts as premises in reasoning, but to do that, you need to kind of, unless it's a hypothetical reasoning, they need to become yours in a sense, right? I mean, so you can communicate something to me and I can use that as a premise in reasoning. But I was thinking more of a necessary condition. So if I don't do that, and if something just pops into my head and I think it's not mine, then that's not something that I can use as a premise. That's all I was wanting to say. And I think that kind of does emerge from the thought insertion case. So I don't want to make any claim that you can't co-opt other people's thoughts into your own reasoning. Of course you can. Mm-hmm. But if you have an alien thought, then that's not something that you can use to. Typically, people, they don't want these things.
Yeah, unless you have to agree with the thought, but agreement is not ownership, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. So what I was going to say is, if you have looked into virtual reality experiments, because there are some interesting results in which people put on a helmet, VR helmet, and both have visual feedback from a virtual body and sensory feedback, and then they start moving away the virtual body, and there's a point in which the virtual body is far enough that even if they get the right sensory feedback, they don't have the sense of ownership. So I think that goes very well into your explanation.
That's great. Can you send me some references?
Oh yeah, and just last thing.
I'm too old-fashioned.
But you say in your paper that mechanisms related to A and B location make possible bodily ownership. But do you have any more specific views? For example, would you say that bodily ownership is a function of A and B locations, or also would you say ownership is something that goes by degrees, or if there is any cutoff point? Do you have any views on those specifics?
I haven't thought about it. I certainly haven't thought about the. I haven't thought about the degrees case.
Okay.
But I will. Thank you.
Okay.
David.
So I almost hate to raise this, but I can't help it. Ownership is such a loaded term because of the law.
Because of
the law. Law is the social institution around which questions of ownership are considered and resolved. Now, there is a phenomenology of property relations that might ground the legal institutions of ownership. But I don't feel like ownership is the right term at all for our relations to our own bodies. I think rather that look at the nature of the phenomenology or the arguments from Husserl and the guy I mentioned before you, Reinhard, about the grounding of property relations between agents and property of different types, it is completely unlike those about which our relations with our own bodies consider. So as an example, the nature, and this is also Lockean, so the nature of our claims to ownership of movables or real estate has to do with our abilities to indicate to others our relations to those objects. So we put needs and bounds around a piece of property, or we put a little label on our hammer or whatever. And we also do something else. We indicate our possession of the object or the land in these ways. So Locke accounts for, something you did mention, the realistic ability to control that thing as being part of the groundedness of the property relation or the ownership. But bodies are the things that do that. So I think the term that makes the most sense for what you're saying is identity. So to go to Parfit, I think you would be better off saying that, not that we own our bodies, but that we are identical with them. And there's a reason I've been concerned the whole time because in order for us to make those to do those indicia of ownership over other sorts of things, we have to be able to do certain signals, social signals, but that's not necessary for our identity with our body. And so I think there is a crucial distinction.
Points well taken. Ownership is not a great word. It carries all sorts of baggage of distinctness for a start. I mean, you're not identical to your car, and so
right.
But at the same time, look, it's the word in the literature, so I think we use it with caution. But there's more going on here than your relation to your whole body. And if you think about, particularly in some of these pathological cases, what is it that someone is lacking if they have unilateral neglect? It's not identity. There's some sort of they feel that something is not of concern to them, or they feel that something is not something they can act with. Those are that's what's going on there.
But we don't. But we.
And the thought is, this is not me. That's really this is not me. This is not mine.
Right, but the rest of us would recognize that the person with unilateral neglect is still on that other side of themselves, regardless of their sense that they are.
Right, but there is a psychological, there are different psychological attitudes that you can take to things in terms of their relation. And a better word is, look, is this mine or is this me? And that's the thought that you have with thoughts and with body parts as well. And I think, look, as long as it's clear that that's what you're talking about, you just continue using the terminology that we use. It's not that important. It's just like any other technical term. We could just call it Fred.
Except that ownership does imply the ability to alienate yourself with the thing owned. You can have joint ownership.
Yeah, that too, but you can alienate yourself on the thing owned too. I mean, that's the source of those folks that came up in the talk last Thursday. You weren't there, but the stylites, the people who live on pillars, and the people who engage in mortification of the flesh, and so on and so forth. I think let's not get hung up on the word ownership. There are some more interesting issues here. So Lorena and Santiago, and then back to Alejandro.
I just am a little curious, given your theory that, there's a relationship, it's very, a very good relationship between, on the one hand, agency and body ownership, as well as psychological ownership. What would you say about, would your theory in some way, in some perhaps tenuous way, would it apply to some animals, some non-human animals? Would you say something? Well, I don't know if you had anything to say about that, or thought about it.
Well, I mean, if you thought about ownership, or ownership in inverted commas, right? I mean, if you thought about ownership primarily in terms of what you are concerned with, what you have a particular affective relationship with, then for sure, right? I mean, that's going to go everywhere in the animal kingdom.
Right, but I mean, they do have some psychology, I guess, and they also have probably proprioception.
Absolutely, absolutely. So all of those things and this idea about space is transferable to, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you've got 2 legs or 4, right? I mean, it's so I think all that stuff is transferable. The difficulty that I would have is that I took a very intellectualist approach to thinking about ownership. So start with the judgments and then work with the grounds for those judgments. So you need to take a different tack, but the basic phenomenon that I'm exploring is, so what is this? It's basically, what are the grounds for your sense of yourself as an embodied self? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. And I've argued for many years that is something that we need to be thinking about at a non-linguistic and pre-linguistic level. It just takes different forms. Oh, yes, you haven't held a question for a while, so, and then I'll come back.
I'm sorry. My concern again is about internal body parts. I'm sorry.
That's
because I was thinking in cases like personalización or Cotard. And
sorry, what?
These people, I was thinking
Depersonalization.
yeah, I'm sorry. Or Cotard, and these people say like I don't have a heart, no, this heart is not mine, or something like that. And I was wondering, how do you explain that in terms of agency? I mean, it seems easy in.
But I don't need to, do I?
I'm sorry?
I don't need to, do I?
I don't know. It's just a question.
No, I don't think I need to explain it, because I'm not offering an account of what's going that's going to explain what's going wrong in Cotard. There are all sorts of strange things that might be happening, and strange psychological things that don't have anything to do with people's experience of their own body. For something, I think what would be a really problematic counter example to me would be if we had a situation where someone said one of 2 things. This is a body part of, I experience this as a body part of mine, but I can't do anything with it. Or there is something that I can act on directly, but it's not me. It's not part of me. And I struggle with both of those. The only ones that I can think of for the first example are some body parts that you don't do a whole lot with, like your kidneys. But then I don't experience my kidneys.
Yeah.
And then in the second case, I can act with it, but it's not part of me. The only situation which I could see that coming about would be prosthetic. And then you say, well, you're acting with it, but it's not. It's just like a tool. So it's not something that's going to have an A location and a B location and stuff.
So maybe I didn't get it right, but if I understood you well, part of the argument against the phenomenological view is that
against the qualia view. Yeah, the qualia.
You have you want to think about ownership in terms more of judgments, and you repeated it.
I want to start with that.
Yeah, you want to start with that. But then you
that's not my objection to the. That's not my objection to the qualia.
But then you said that the qualia view can somehow explain how the origin of the qualia, but not the justification of the judgment or something like that?
No, so
Because I didn't understand what role was the justification part playing in your argument.
so
Because I don't think you need it. So
okay, well let me try again then.
yes.
So why do I think there's not a qualia of ownership? Because I don't think that it can do the work it needs to do. And what it needs to do is to explain how we experience our bodies as our own, or our thoughts as our own. Why can't it do that? Because you can describe it either internally or externally. I don't know what an internal description of a qualia looks like. I mean, the whole point about a qualia is that you can't give an internal description of it. So the only description we've got is an external.
Okay.
But the external one then is the same as what we're trying to explain.
Okay.
So I think I do need the intellectual argument if I want to.
Okay.
The epistemological argument if I want to explain why the qualia is not a useful theoretical positive.
Okay. So I think yeah.
Santiago.
Yeah, I have a question about your views on agency, because I think your first objection was, look, they are explaining the causal underpinnings, but they are not dealing with the normative reasons.
Right.
Question I'm interested in.
So this is about Campbell Frey.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I'm curious to know about how far you want to go with them on the causal side, because there are some possible problems with the motor, with the comparator model. So I mean, you need motor instructions so that you can compare. But Campbell is worried about what are these motor instructions in the case of thoughts. That's pretty enigmatic, and he mentions the kind of regress that comes with that. So that's my first worry. So would you like to apply that model in your causal account? And the second part is, these people also very often like to talk about the phenomenology of agency. And it seems to be that your anscons.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is a one-stop epistemology shop. So the same argument is going to work for the sense of agency.
Exactly. So then you fail independence at least. So because you also see Chris Peacock trying to create a ground for the phenomenology of agency, but you don't satisfy independence. So what would you make of this alleged phenomenon of
nonsense on stilts? Okay. It's what Bentham famously said about rights. It's nonsense on stilts.
Okay, so then let's go to the first part. So because I think there are some asymmetries there in it, it seems difficult to give a clear account of what these motor instructions are in the case of thought. So what would you say about that?
I mean, I think his worries are well founded, and the thing from that whole literature that I want to take is really the distinction between the two components of psychological ownership. How you get there, or how you might apply that to schizophrenia is, it's interesting, but it could all fall apart and I'd be perfectly happy. I do worry, like he does, about regressors. It's a complete mystery to me how thoughts originate, but the thought that there's an original thought that then gets translated as an instruction to create another thought does plainly lead to some sort of regress. I'm much more sympathetic to the idea that thinking starts with a process of internal speaking that is context driven, but that's a different. That's nothing that I say here. I think depends on that.
Okay,
but yeah, I do want to emphasize that I think the sense of agency is, the qualia of agency is just as much nonsense as the qualia of mindless.
Good. I think there were questions.
Yeah, Esteban.
Yes, I had a question specifically about vision, but it's related to the topic of how these are the integrated cognitive field that involves the A location and B location is related to the Cartesian objective, I guess, third personal view that is not, that does not involve ownership or this, right? Or the self in any peculiar way. But the thing is this, I think you suggested that vision is a little bit different than, let's say, the sense of touch and proprioception, etc. Like, I'm not sure, I got the feeling that you were suggesting that probably vision is more tightly linked to the Cartesian field representation, like the objective representation of the world, not in terms of ownership or myself. But anyway,
am I right about that? Yeah, no, I think you are right. But so Merleau-Ponty says many interesting things, but not all of them are true. And then he makes a distinction between the subjective body and the objective body, and then he draws us to, the third personal and the first personal, and he goes kind of metaphysical. And I think that's a mistake. This is all objective. So this is just two different ways of representing objective space.
Right.
It's not, so one thing that Merleau-Ponty says, I actually wrote a long article about Merleau-Ponty, God knows why I did that. But one of the things he says is that, the world stops at the limits of my body. The objective world stops at the limits of my body. No, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't.
Very good. So, I was getting back to the issue of the mirror for the phantom limb. It looks like what we can represent in a purely visual way gets very easily integrated with this integrated somatosensory affective cognitive field, right? Immediately somebody can release the tension, the muscular tension, and get rid of the pain in seconds, right? So it doesn't look like there's like a strong modularity or totally that the integrated cognitive is totally encapsulated and the vision is outside of it, or maybe, there seems to be some lots of interaction there. And I was thinking, what if we just expand from there and think of when you look at yourself in the mirror far away and you recognize that it's yourself, like in Perry's example, that, first there's somebody there, what are they doing? But when you realize it's yourself, immediately your relationship to that thing that you're representing out there changes, right? So I was just wondering about that, about if vision is integrated and if that may connect to how in the end also, not sure, the whole Cartesian field is integrated with A and B location, because what it looks like it happens with the phantom limb in the mirror, right, is that mostly a B location is maybe you could say B location is inferred from the Cartesian field, or is B location also visual directly, not mediated by the mirror?
I don't think so. I think that the A location, B location stuff is for the touch, proprioception, vestibular, kinesthetic modalities.
Right.
So not for vision. I think for vision, you're really talking about a coordinate system that's based on the origin of the field of view. So you ask reasonably, how does that connect to this idea that there's an integrated sensory field? And well, it's complex. So, and it's complex, it involves multiple modalities, but also multiple coordinate systems. And I think that's a familiar idea, because as you think about action, even any motor theorist, even someone who doesn't believe any of this A and B stuff, thinks that in thinking about a simple bodily movement, you've got a coordinate system based on your eyes, derived from vision. You've got to think about the coordinates on a hand-centered frame of reference, which allows you to control your grasping movements and your reaching movements.
Right.
So it's already part of the basic theoretical picture here that there are multiple coordinate systems. And I'm just throwing in another one that is just fundamentally different. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's ever thought that well, got to be careful about saying that. There's nothing that's absolutely no one's ever thought of, but not many people have probably thought that there is one single coordinate system and everything in bodily movement is relative to that single coordinate. Everyone understands. I think most people understand that however you think about movement, it involves coordination, calibration across multiple reference frames. And what I'm throwing out is that this A B location captures one internal part of it.
Right. But also on what you perceive visually, you would have some sense of what parts you have agency over, etc.
So the problem.
Right.
Exactly. So and these things can go awry. Right. So you can have the sense that you can have the awareness of where your hand is, poised for action, A location, B location, everything's ready. But somehow that doesn't get appropriately mapped onto the vision thing. So actually something else it's targeted.
No, finish.
No, I had finished. But I never got the opportunity to show you my pictures. So this was Ma, right? So thinking about the joints.
Yeah.
So think about all of the body parts as cylinders. And then within those cylinders, think about a location in a coordinate system based on the center of the center of mass of the joint. So if you think about this is a very short arm, then the origin is down there in the middle of the elbow. And this is the A location piece. And then I have no idea where this picture came from, but it's a nice indication of what it would look like to relocate the pain in your foot in terms of all of these joint angles. And then you can see, I think this picture helps you see that this way of representing space really does so in a way that makes it very clear how you move, because I haven't got a pointer, but if you look at that top theta, the angle of the trunk, that's the one you want to change if you want to move forward or sit up. And so if you want to kick somebody, then it's that angle that says theta thigh that needs to become smaller.
That's from cognitive robotics?
Sorry?
That's from cognitive robotics?
I don't know where it's from. Thank you very much. There are copyright issues there.